really didn't consider pursuing storyboarding until I actually came across a senior when I was my second year in school. She was going into storyboarding, and she had this amazing portfolio that was catered to like feature and TV. And then at the time when I was reviewing her portfolio, a character teacher was kind of like, "Hey, I did storyboards for the Batman opening sequence, like for the animated Batman TV series." So he brought samples of that, and I think it just blew me away, like how detailed and beautiful and graphic and how movement was really shown. And I think from that point on, I was like, it's done. The deal is sealed. I made the deal with the devil. And then I think I came across some boards done by Dan Milligan as well. And then it really expanded kind of like what storyboarding was for me. Because I always thought like, oh, it's very specific to animation. It's very specific to this. But after I saw like what the possibility was and also what it means for like game and animatics in that sequence, like it made it more interesting to me. Because it wasn't just like, hey, like create one character or create a set of these. Like it was really like a breadth of work in terms of like, where's this character at? Like, what are they acting like? Or what's their behavior like? So you kind of really think more in film, and that really made me want to pursue it more. I basically backtracked and rebuilt my portfolio from scratch and then started boarding more in animation. But I had to really ask myself, like, what type of animation work did I want to go into? Is it feature or is it TV? Because they're vastly different. And I think I, in a masochistic way, love the commercial aspect of it. Like, you get 2-3 days to board something. And I was like, let's do it. So I really wanted to go into TV because I enjoy how fast paced it is. I enjoy that you get new ideas and scripts every 6 weeks. So then I catered specifically to that. And then I really enjoyed comedy boarding, mainly because I grew up with like SpongeBob, and All Real Monsters is really going to impact you and your humor. So then I started going that way. So yeah, now I'm in animation. Animation board artists actually have to be the actor themselves. So if you get a script, most of the script has dialogue, has certain actions, but when you're boarding, you really have to think about like, okay, well, what's this character behave like? What are their mannerisms going to be compared to another character? And I think that's kind of a problem I see when I notice like student work. A lot of times, some of the samples is like all the characters behave exactly the same, so there's no range. I know when it comes to live action, like they don't want that. And I think that was kind of the problem I had when I first started, because I would overboard, kind of like, this person's gonna move like this, and I'll get notes back where it's like, no, don't, this is like 10 panels extra, and I was like, oops. But I enjoy that. I enjoy getting into the skin of my character and kind of being like, well, what would they behave like? I guess one good example would be like, how does SpongeBob behave like compared to like Patrick, but they're both really dumb characters. Like the way they behave and their paranoia is like completely separate, but they exist in the same world. So I would say like that's the biggest difference. And also in boarding in animation, like you go off kind of like one design of a background, and the rest you kind of have to make up in your mind. I think sometimes well, I know different now because I know in feature everything's CG, so it's kind of the same thing. But I know when it was commercial boarding, at least in my experience, like people sent me like photos like, this is exactly where we're going to shoot. Like, please don't turn any other corner because it's not built out. So it was very locked in. So it was kind of like, at least they had reference photos, so I know exactly where to shoot, and it wasn't me making it up. But in animation, it'll kind of be like, hey, here's an exterior of a school, and this whole thing's going to happen outside. And you're like, okay, what's the reverse of the school? And they're like, I don't know, figure it out. And I'm like, ah. My personal favorite director at this time is probably Gendy, mainly because I grew up like watching his stuff from Dexter's Lab all the way to like his current show Primal, and I guess I really appreciate his development of like, hey, you came from Dexter, which is like really funny. You can really clear cut characters of who they are, what Dexter's like and what Dee Dee's like, and the whole world, and like Mandark. But then you get like Samurai Jack, which is like completely departure from Dexter's Lab, and I was like, what is this? And on top of that, it's set in such a mishmash world where it's not really like cyberpunk, but it's not really like solar punk future either, which people have this idea of like sci-fi now, of like everything's being green in the future, everything's gonna be like total shit in the future. His thing was really like everything from the past still exists in the future, and everything in the far future will still exist. So everything kind of comes together. But here's this guy from the way past that doesn't know anything, and I guess like the way it was told like made it so much more enjoyable for me, because he gives me everything that I didn't even know I wanted in one series. And then on top of that, like his season 5 was just, in my opinion, just like a masterpiece for like to end that whole series. And then he gives us Primal, and I was like, what is this? Because I feel like Primal is no longer like, oh, it's just a adult animation. For me, it really feels like a breath of his references, which is like a lot of Japanese films, how long he holds a shot, really bringing in the audience like without really any dialogue. For me, I feel like that's a tier where you're like, wow, I want to get there one day. The other person I really appreciate is probably Satoshi Kon. Because whenever I watch his films and I binge his movies, like it no longer feels like, oh, it's just a cartoon for like kids or even adults. Like it really feels like a full-fledged film. And I guess knowing more about him as a director and as a creator for his stuff, like it really felt like he was trying to figure out the story he wants. Because I feel like all his movies kind of have the same idea, but they're retold in a different way, and it feels fresh every time. Until his final film, which is my favorite, Paprika, which really bends the line of reality and dreams. And I guess I really appreciated the fact that he really took the medium of animation and took it to a field where I thought, like, that's where it should go. It shouldn't just be like slapstick, or it shouldn't just be like really dramatic. Like, he really bends the line of like, is it real or is it not? I guess I see myself currently, even though I'm a director, still more of an illustrator. I guess because like I look up to a lot of writers. Because in my mind, I'm like, that's so crazy. How do you just write and it just comes to you? Like sometimes I feel like I get like constipated in my thought. Even if I could come up with stuff, I definitely have that thing where it's not as good as what the writer would come up with. So I'm like, I'm not at that tier yet. So I guess in some sense I still consider myself as an illustrator, because I am coming up with ideas that's already pre-written. But I guess that's just my personal view. So when it is in live action, it is common misconception that people are like, oh, you must animate things.
Oh my god. On a regular basis, people think I'm an animator.
Yeah, maybe they think it's got something to do with animation, but
outside the industry, they think it's animation.
Although they might think we're in animation.
But now that I am in animation, I can say yes. I think the most common misconception is that when you're boarding in live action, people do kind of think like, oh, well, so you just draw like a couple of things and then what happens? Like they don't really know. Or people do think you animate, but that's like totally not what it is. In animation, I think it's kind of the same aspect. Like people think like you're the one actually physically hand animating it, but it's actually not the case either. We're putting in key poses so that when we ship it overseas, which mostly handles the animation aspect of it, like they do the in-betweens. And depending on if your show is a puppet show or if it's actually hand-drawn, like it'll differ how production works. But for animation-specific misconceptions, I just think people have this idea of like, oh, if you're a board artist, like you must be dictating what's going to happen in the show. And I'm like, no. Usually we have a script. Most shows now are script-driven, so they have like a very set idea of where they're going to go. But I can kind of understand that idea because animation is so vast in how we handle things. Like most shows are script-driven now, but there has been instances where people are board-driven shows, where the storyboard artist actually does come up with the dialogue. We do come up with everything else, but there's still a premise, like an outline of like, hey, this is what's going to happen first, then this, and then the end's going to happen here, but you have to fill in the rest. So animation is kind of more like, nebulous, I guess, in that sense, where it can go a lot of directions, but at the end of the day, like, we're not hand animating it. So common misconception even within production is that the board artist will design everything. That's actually not our job. I mean, we can, but then that ends up starting to like bleed into like the designer's job of like, hey, what's the background look like? What's the characters look like? But I do understand it because it starts to blur a little bit if we don't have certain characters. Like, we kind of have to make it up on the spot, but that does get handed off to a designer later who ends up kind of cleaning it up and making it better. That's the same case with backgrounds. Like, if we do have a background of like, I don't know, like a riverbed or something like that, but then the script says like, hey, like the character turns around to the other side and we actually don't have a design for that, we do have to make it up. So I think sometimes people in production can kind of have this idea that board artists are also designers. And I think even within board artists, like some artists love making stuff up, which is like awesome, but it's kind of like, well, if you do it, then someone else might have to like get stressed out that they have to do it. But it's not at all what that is. So I think between ourselves as board artists on a show and even production, it starts to blur the line of like what's okay. And that's probably the biggest problem I see. I feel like the biggest hardship going from boarding to directing is being able to multitask on top of what you were already doing. And what I mean by that is like managing people. I feel like when you're boarding, a lot of it is kind of like in your own mind and you're like, oh, this works and I know it can work. So you kind of like focus only on solely that. But when you're directing on animation, it's not that whatsoever. So it's kind of like your idea of what you thought it was, you kind of have to let go of it. Because I know when I came in, I was like, oh, I'm going to really focus on like my episodes. Totally not realizing I have like 5 to 10 episodes I'm juggling at the same time. So sometimes I know that the board artist knows their episode really, really well. So a lot of times when I'm working on maybe episode 10, I have to go back to episode 3 and be like, what was I doing there again? And I have to like refresh my memory, but I usually have to do it like within a minute because the artist will kind of ask me like, hey, what do you want me to do here? And I'm like, what's here? What episode are you on again? So currently on my show right now, we actually do have rough pitches and then we have a final pitch. That can be kind of nerve-wracking because I think when I was at working on adult animation projects, like they usually don't pitch. It's usually just put together in an animatic and they'll just kind of watch it through with the actual voice acting and things like that. So it's a lot more clear. With my current show, I guess it's more on like, hey, let's go to the rough pitch. And then we'll go to a final pitch once it's clean. And a lot of that kind of has to do with like me getting into the voice of the character. So if a character is kind of like, kind of an asshole, you kind of have to get into your asshole hat and be like, all right, let's do this. And you start doing the voices, you start doing a little action. And I think you kind of have to practice it before you actually pitch because you, in my mind, have a very specific way of how the timing's going to work out. So if there's a comedic beat or things like that, like you actually kind of have to pitch that along with it. And I think the most nerve-wracking thing is probably like when you're pitching and nobody laughs. And now you're like, you still have to pitch, but in the back of your head, you're like, oh shit, did I fuck up? Like, was that not funny? And then the whole time you're just like, oh God, but now you're thinking on that while you're trying to pitch the rest of the story. And now your brain's like, wait, what am I doing? And then you kind of go into this black hole of a pitch. Usually for me, I tend to kind of go into the script and just start immediately working on thumbs, just digitally. And I think I know I get in my head a lot. So sometimes I'll stop myself from like boarding because I try to do it in my head. And I think over the years, I just had to tell myself, just vomit it. Nobody's going to see this. It's just between you and God. So put your sins out now and just do everything. So then I'll just vomit all the potential ideas, even though they may not hook up. And then I'll kind of go back and forth between the thumbs and then the script, and I'll start immediately crossing out scenes that might not work. And that usually relieves a lot of my anxiety and stress. Because otherwise I get like mentally constipated and I'm like, nothing's coming to me. So then once I get that, then I'll actually work it out into roughs. And roughs in animation is completely different from thumbs, because thumbs is like really quick chicken scratch, maybe like a bobblehead or a stick figure of like, this is where the framing is. But in roughs, you start putting in base acting. Is this person scared? Or is there a shadow over here that starts looming? Like, we really start thinking those things out. And then we pitch it kind of like either as a rough pitch to our showrunners or to our own directors. Then they get a pretty good sense of it, and then they might have other redlining notes for us, and then we go to a clean. But the clean is, unless you really messed up, the clean is not really for reboarding everything. It really is just to kind of go in there and be like, all right, let's start putting the characters on model. Let's start really putting expressions here, put in between poses as needed. So it really shines through, and it becomes almost like the final episode. Specific to animation, I feel like the biggest taboo is definitely missing deadlines and not communicating. Those are the two biggest problems I think I've dealt with, both when I was a board artist and both when I was currently directing now. When I was a board artist, the reason why it's the biggest taboo amongst each other is that if someone misses a deadline, it falls on the other board artists to pick up their slack. And I think that really stresses us out, especially when you're a TV schedule, because we usually average anywhere from like 5 to 7 week schedule for an episode. So you can get anywhere from like 2 to 3 weeks to rough out your boards, and then the rest of the time is for cleaning. Depending on how complicated your show is and how many team members you have, if one person messes up or they can't hit a deadline or they just disappear, which has happened, like, and nobody can get in contact with them, then now, like, as a director, you're like, all right, guys, let's shift over. And then let's overhaul it. You're just like, oh God. So it's like, you can go from being totally calm to becoming hyper anxious for like 2 weeks. And it's like by no fault of your own. It's usually because someone messed up. I think live action is a lot more predominantly male from my experience. I think I was fortunate enough when I started, there was a lot of female directors at the time when I was coming in. So I kind of got a taste of it when I talked to other artists, but it wasn't necessarily my experience. So I feel like I had a really positive experience, at least in terms of commercial and short films. In animation, it's like a different story because it's not really predominantly male. It's actually pretty, in my opinion, like evenly split. I worked with a lot of people where it is like half male, half female. There's a huge female crew of boarding, and then there's like maybe like 30% male. So it's been a different experience, at least for me currently. That said, I've also worked with directors that are older that I guess came up with more predominantly male thinking, I guess, experience. So sometimes when I talk with them, they'll kind of be like, yeah, that's cute what your thought is, but it won't really matter because, you know, I'm your boss. And I was like, okay. Thanks. And I think it also attributed to when I started directing and I was going for a job, I think a previous director of mine, I think, was going for the same job. I'm not 100% sure. But the way they were describing it kind of felt like, oh, we're going for the same position. And I think he kind of low-key was like, oh, well, you're just lucky because you're a girl and you're also like not white. So they're going to pick you because of that. And I was like, okay. It made me feel like shit. So when I did get the position for directing, I didn't tell anyone. I was like, oh, well, they're just going to think that I got it because like I'm Asian and I'm a girl, not because I'm good. So I was like, I'm going to be real quiet. I think there are a lot of people that are older that have worked at like the prime age of Disney or like the prime age of TV, and they do kind of come forward with like, I'm the best because I've only worked with the best. So when you work with them, like immediately you get kind of turned off because you're like, I really don't want to work with you. And it's not just the ego, it's kind of like the dismissiveness of like, I know better than you, so just like shut up and just do the work kind of thing. And I think that makes the experience of working so negative, because now it goes from, oh, I've always dreamed of this career to, oh, now it's just a 9 to 5 kind of feeling. And I think that's like such a waste as an artist, because a lot of it is from like your own personal emotion or your personal acting that goes into animation. But I think I will always have imposter syndrome, especially when I look back at my old work. I'm like, how did I get here? Who am I? I think when I started out, I originally kind of had that idea anyway, because I did look at like the top tier people, and I kind of always compared my work to them. I guess in hindsight, that does help, because then you're kind of always comparing yourself to like professionals, not just your peers. So I guess that helped, but I always have that feeling of like, I'm gonna get caught. Someone's gonna find out I don't know how to draw. I don't know how to talk. Someone's gonna find out I'm just making shit up along the way. And then they're gonna fire me, and I'm gonna be like, oh, I had this coming. Yeah, I don't think that ever goes away, but I feel like that's a shared feeling amongst artists a lot. And I guess in a way, like, when I do come across artists that are like super like, I'm the best, I'm always like, what? That feels weird to me. But I guess in some sense it makes me feel better, because I've talked to friends who work at Pixar or feature in Disney, and they've told me like, yeah, I've worked with Glenn Keane, and even he's like, oh yeah, someone's gonna find out that I'm an imposter, and I'm like, what? But I guess there's solace in knowing that like all of us have the exact same feeling. So I think for me it was really helpful, but it was more helpful in the sense of work ethic. I went to art center, which is like super expensive. Do not recommend if you do not have rich parents. Those loans. But yeah, I think the quality of having other people that were also like the best at their school, or like the best within their peers, and then we all kind of come together. It felt like a battle royale of like, we're gonna duke it out, because everybody comes in with this kind of ego, like, I'm the best. And then you see other people that are like just so incredibly good that you're like, I can't even fathom how they got there. And we're like the same age, or maybe like a couple years apart. So I guess in that sense, like, it really settles your ego. And I think if you're a teenager coming into that, like, it really gives you a good perspective of like, hey, don't have that ego for yourself. Like, you kind of have to be better. And then on top of that, just like skill set, the type of things I learned from a lot of my professors really did teach me how to be professional, and how to manage yourself as a professional. And that a lot of times clients don't give a fuck if you work on 7 different projects. They only care about theirs. And I was like, yeah, I think when you're in high school, you tell your teacher like, I forgot my homework because I was working on another one, and they'll usually let it slide. But like, yeah, when you're working professional, nobody cares. I think when I was younger, I was a lot more lazy. I feel like I went from like 0 to 100 in work ethic. I think my school really grinded me down to a bone, and then they're like, we're gonna rebuild you. But I think I would probably, if I could go back in time, and I will tell myself some tips, I think it was definitely like, be confident in your personality, because that really does go a long way. And I think skill is something you can always get better at, because there's always people that might be better than you, but they're also like a guiding light to what you could do, and that really does help. But personality is harder to teach. It's harder to tell someone or look at someone and be like, I want to be like that person and know how to do that. So I guess like just being confident in who you are as a person really does matter. I think that's probably what I would focus on the most. I'm the one. I'm the one that ruins it for live action people. I try really hard not to let people know I'm gonna fire them. Because it's usually like, hey guys, this has been so great. They're gonna know who they are. Okay, trying to be as vague. Okay, it's not gonna be vague. Whatever, I'll just say it.